for those of you who are not familiar with it, because I realized from a previous screening that this is a challenge for Americans who are not even familiar sometimes with the word sectarianism. In Lebanon, as you've seen in the film, globally, generally speaking, half the population is Christian and half is Muslim. Those are changing, but historically, because of the multicultural, pluralistic and multi-confessional the demographics of Lebanon, they decided since the independence of the country that the parliament is going to represent different communities by having basically a quota for religious groups. So this is what was mentioned, and this is still going on to this time where you have, and I actually have a little map here for the different districts in Lebanon. So I have, like, for Beirut, will show you, there are 3 districts in Beirut. One has 2 Sunni, 1 Maronite, 1 Greek or Catholic, and 1 Orthodox, and 1 Protestant. These are like the seats for that district. And this gives you a sense of the distribution. So generally, Lebanon is made up of Maronite, Catholic Christians, which is the majority of Christians in the country, and Greek Orthodox, and Armenian churches. These are like the big ones, and then there are a lot of smaller churches. And on the Muslim side, there are Sunni, Shia, and Druze, which is not exactly Muslim, but they kind of fall under that category. So these are like the biggest portions of demographics. And depending on the regions and the districts around the country, they choose the number of representatives in parliament and how many seats they're going to have. And that's what people vote for. So I just wanted to kind of give this a general introduction. Let's see, what else do I want to talk about? And you've gotten a general idea from the film, but some of the issues are that men and women both don't have access to media, to finances, to the political process in general, because it's been for the last, so let me back up. There was a civil war between 75 and 90, and after that it's been another 15 years of post-war period. And before that were the golden years of Lebanon in general. So if we look throughout all of this time, there has always been in power a number of families that come back. It's like a little bit of a feudal system, a clan system, family-based, where some of big name families that have power and money, they tend to recycle through power in governmental leadership. And it's very hard for an independent to break through and get in, whether a man or a woman. So that's still a problem. And we talk about that particular problem about women, but it's true for men. So what else? These are like the main points I really wanted to mention so that you have a little bit bigger context, so you know what to ask me. If you have more questions, sure, I'll take them. That's all I want to say for now.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your film with us. I'm sure that it was a labor of love. She was mentioning she made it in 2009, so I'm sure to see it come to fruition, and it's really exciting for us to get to hear directly from you about the impetus for creating it and such. I think that also gives us a really good sense of the complexity of the issues in Lebanon, and just the array of barriers that women face. And now what we're going to do is turn to Sarah Katie, who works here at NDI in our Middle East and North Africa team as a senior program assistant, and she's going to talk a bit about what NDI is doing in Lebanon in this context that now we have a bit better sense of. So, thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, Rouane, for making this film. It was really fascinating to watch, and it also allowed us to have the opportunity to have an event on Lebanon, which I don't like talking about Lebanon too much, and I think part of the reason is it's a complicated political system, and sometimes you could call it maybe a black hole, if we wanted to just say it. If we look at what's going on right now in Lebanon, we're in a presidential vacuum. There's no president. A president was supposed to be elected by the parliament by May 25th. That didn't happen. We haven't had parliamentary elections since 2009. They were supposed to happen last summer. They were delayed for 17 months. If you ask anyone in Lebanon right now if they think it will actually happen in November, most will say, they'll laugh at you and say no. And then when we look at women, just specifically, there are no laws protecting women. There are no laws that, there's no quota. There is no law that says political parties have to have a certain number of women on a candidate list. There's an outdated electoral law that a lot of people think should be reformed. But so like when we look at this context, I watched the film, and the women's team asked me, it's a little, Lebanon feels it's hard not to be pessimistic about Lebanon. And so I had a discussion with the country director, Heather Theron, before speaking today, and I was like, and I asked her, it's so hard not to be pessimistic about what's going on. And she said, it's not about being pessimistic or optimistic, it's about being realistic and just recognizing all of the challenges and then trying to find a way, ever so slightly to do something. And so NDI has been working with women, since we started in the country, but our main goal with our women programming is to support women who have a desire to participate politically through coalition building, and more specifically to try to motivate women to get on a list. To that end, NDI in the last 2 years has been working with a coalition called Women in Parliament. It was established in the fall of 2012, and really it just was established very organically. NDI, the elections were coming within 9 months. They were supposed to happen in June 2013, so NDI got together a group of women, leaders of different NGOs. As the video said, there's 140 kind of big women NGOs, and so we just, through our contacts, got a couple of these women together. They met, they started talking about the different things that these different organizations were doing, and at the end of the meeting, they asked us to have a second meeting, and then they asked us to have a third meeting. And so from there, they kind of just progressed forward, and then NDI started doing different kinds of trainings with the women, and eventually they labeled themselves Women in Parliament, and they released a statement at the end of 2012, ahead of the supposed elections, and the statement was, it was well thought out, it was concise, and it called for action at 5 different levels of society, from a quota in the Lebanese parliament to getting more women involved in a proposed election commission, and they called for action from the Minister of Interior. They called for parties to implement some kind of quota to ensure women's names on a candidate list. They called for CSOs to support women, to offer funding for women candidates, and to offer volunteers in different kinds of services. And they called for the media to focus, to cover women candidates like men candidates are covered, in the sense of just not following women and looking at their families or that kind of thing, but looking at their background, their accomplishments, their platforms. And following the release of the statement, they went and they met with all these different political party leaders. They met with the Minister of Interior, and there was a lot of momentum for the movement. It was kind of unfortunate that the elections were then postponed for 17 months, but Women in Parliament is still going strong. We actually just had a meeting with members yesterday, so this was perfect timing. And they were discussing, different kind of activities that they could do to go forward. They're planning a workshop that NDI is going to help co-sponsor in July. And so, the goal is to try to maintain this coalition so that there is a women's support group out there ready for when elections might happen. So in addition to this Women in Parliament coalition that NDI helps support, we also just finished a STEPS program, and through the STEPS program we worked with Laude, who was featured very heavily in the film, and also with CCER, which is the Civil Campaign for Electoral Reform, which is kind of like the sister organization of Laude. And both these organizations are very well run, and they advocate for reform in the electoral law. One of the reasons that the parliamentary elections, there were many reasons, but one of the reasons that a lot of people cite is that a lot of people wanted a reformed electoral law before the next round of parliamentary elections. And there was a lot of debate about a new electoral law in terms of like reforming how the whole system of Lebanon would vote, basically, including like proportional representation and all kinds of factors, but the women's quota was kind of far down on the list of things that they were going to talk about. But the law never came to fruition, and so since the parliamentary elections were delayed, we worked with CCR and LADE as they do all kinds of very interesting techniques to advocate for a women's quota. And they do advocate for a 30% women's quota in Parliament, but as Rouane was saying, one of the reasons that a lot of people, you talk about a women's quota in Lebanon, a lot of people will kind of laugh at you again, because basically because of how the structure of the political system is, its confessional offices are proportionally reserved for representatives from certain religious communities, and then that's coupled with the idea that all of Lebanon could be said to be run by 8 very wealthy families. And so trying to, I mean, a lot of people look at elections already as kind of suspect. Some people would even call them rigged. So, trying to change the balance of power, men or women, is going to be difficult. And so adding an extra layer of a women's quota is something that has proved rather difficult. And so what CCR has kind of shifted and looked at a more realistic goal that could be accomplished without reforming the entire political system is to advocate for some kind of legislation to force parties to include women candidates on their lists. And in particular, they want 30% of the women, 30% of the names on the list would be women, so every third name would be a woman. So that's kind of what they're focusing on right now. We'll see what happens. And then, so speaking of the quota and then the women's focusing on political parties, one thing that NDI in particular recently has been trying to focus on is trying to support women in parties specifically. And one of the big challenges that NDI has noted is that there just really isn't a lot of support, a lot of programming support for women in their political parties. And so NDI has started to build relationships with different parties. And we actually held a campaign school in March of 2014, so a few months ago, where we got together 30 women from various political parties, both from March 8 and March 14, which are the 2 main political blocs in Lebanon. And we brought these women together to kind of it was 5 days of intensive training on political campaign skills, from messaging to volunteer recruitment to voter targeting. And we were a little nervous going into the event. NDI we haven't really done an event like this where we brought together women across party lines to do a training. And so it was actually really exciting, nervous, and at the end of it, we felt really positive about what we had witnessed and what women had experienced. The event emphasized that women can work across party lines, can work on issues beyond just women's issues, which is another common mantra that you're going to hear in Lebanon, is that women should just focus on women's issues. And so it inspired us. We hope that we can try to find more ways to do other workshops like this. We think that it was a good sign that we can try to help build the women's skills within parties, and hopefully through them they can start climbing the ranks in the parties. So that's just a little bit about NDI's programming. Before I turn the time over, I just want to say give you 2 interesting facts. I'm not going to end on an optimistic tone or anything, I'm going to be realistic. But, I just wanted, so when the 2009 parliamentary elections happened, there were 12 women who ran as candidates. Going into the 2013 elections, which were postponed, there was an open candidate registration time period. And during that time, 44 women did register as candidates. So we went from 12 to 44. So that was really, really exciting. And of those 44, 40 were from different organizations that were part of the Women in Parliament Coalition. So we're hopeful that should parliamentary elections happen for real, either in November or sometime in the future, that hopefully that number can grow even bigger. And one other fun little fact is, so the presidential election that has ended in a presidential vacuum, what was interesting about it, and the way that the president is elected in Lebanon is through the parliament actually votes on the president. And one of the reasons that the parliament has failed to elect a new president is problems of actually meeting quorum to vote, which is always kind of problematic. They won't show up. It's usually because they are protesting something. And so, but nevertheless, there were a lot of people who threw their hats into the ring for the presidential nominee, or to be the president, and there was a woman for the very first time in Lebanon's history. Her name was Nadine Moussa. She's fabulous, actually. We've met her. She participated in NDI's regional campaign school program back in March 2013 in Tunisia. She attempted to run for the 2013 parliamentary elections, which were postponed, and so she decided, well, I'm going to try to run for president. And she went in knowing full well that she was not going to win. But that didn't stop her, and she had an amazing platform. It was all about ending corruption, and the media was, for the first time covering a woman candidate and giving her fair coverage. And you can read, articles, in the Daily Star. She was covering the Daily Star, and so that was really exciting. And they were covering her ideas and her platform. So she just brought a certain level of credibility to women can run for offices at that level, and see what happens going forward.
Thank you, Sarah. I think that was really interesting to hear a bit more about the variety of program approaches that NDI is taking, both working with civil society, but also with parties to increase women's representation and hoping to foster some cross-party collaboration among women. That sounds like it's slowly starting to bear fruit. It's nice to hear those signs of progress amidst some ongoing challenges. So thank you for your remarks. And now we're going to hear from Betty Bernstein-Zabza. We're very pleased to have you here. She's a senior advisor for Near Eastern Affairs and director of operations in the Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues. Betty Bernstein-Zabza has been a Foreign Service Officer with the U.S. Department of State since 1993, and she joined the Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues in July 2013. She has a Master's of Arts degree in Strategic Security Affairs and has served in U.S. embassies in quite a few places: Poland, Switzerland, Israel, and Germany, as well. Did I give them all? Okay. As well as the Pakistan desk officer and as deputy director in the Department of State's Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs. Betty will speak a bit about the broader context in which we're having this discussion of women's representation, but also about some of what the U.S. government is doing, initiatives in this area. So,
thank you very much, Susan, and thanks to NDI for hosting this event and for Rouane for her wonderful film. So just to spark enthusiasm and interest in what's going on in various countries in the Middle East, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the Secretary's Office of Global Women's Issues. I don't know, and actually look a little bit more broadly at these problems in the region. I don't know if, how many people know about our office, know that it exists. It was established in 2009 under Secretary Clinton, and it was made a permanent office in the State Department in 2013 by President Obama, and at that time Milan Verveer had departed, and we have a new ambassador at large for global women's issues. Her name is Kathy Russell. She's coming to us from Jill Biden's office, and we have a lot of new people in our office. And we've been very busy. We have several mandates under which we operate, and several different areas that we focus on. And I just wanted to, number one, just say, we all know the commitment that former Secretary Clinton had on these issues, and also Ambassador Verveer. And we can all rest assured that Secretary Kerry is continuing to build on the incredible platform that former Secretary Clinton and Milan Verveer built. We're continuing to strengthen our work on these issues. You may have heard or seen Secretary Kerry participate in the recent summit in London to prevent and end the sexual violence and conflict, where he made an incredible speech, and I would really recommend to you to Google the speech and read it. It was really an excellent, very strong speech. So we continue to work on these issues. We have several mandates that pushes our work forward, including strategy to prevent and respond to gender-based violence globally. We also have the U.S. National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security, which you may have heard of. This plan, I think it was from 2011, basically is used to implement UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which was passed in 2000 unanimously, to increase women's participation in peace building, conflict resolution, relief and recovery, reconciliation, et cetera, et cetera. It's being kind of slow to implement, but we try to continue to put the pressure to make sure that women are included in these very important processes to bring peace to various regions. I just want to say that much of our work that we do kind of feeds into our other work. We have various priorities. One is we're looking at the cohort of adolescent girls and increasing the welfare of adolescent girls. That'll be one of our priorities in the office. Another one is to, again, prevent and respond to gender-based violence, including in conflict. We're also looking at increasing women's economic participation globally, and also continuing our work to integrate gender issues in the work of the State Department in general, which is an ongoing work in progress, I should say. One reason I bring up adolescent girls, and just to feed our thoughts on this whole issue of women's political participation, is to make the point that by promoting the well-being of adolescent girls, we are, and their ability to continue in school, because we're seeing that we've increased the number of children going to school, primary school. But then you hit a critical time where you see, girls who are 10, 12, 13, whatever, 14 years old, who are dropping out of school, where, their families or whatever need them to work, or the families don't see the value in putting money into them continuing in school. So by looking and focusing on this cohort of adolescent girls, if they're dropping out and they don't see their own worth in continuing in school or participating in the community, then we're losing potential women in the future who will be getting involved and participating politically. So we have to look, it's kind of like, we have to look at various areas that affect women's political participation, and that's one of the areas we're looking at. Now, of course, when looking at the Middle East as a whole, you can't look at it as a monolithic, region in terms of women's, the status of women and girls, basically. When you have countries, for example, like the United Arab Emirates, and we had just traveled there in March, and we met with some amazing women who were, involved in, business women who were involved in government, albeit they do still have some issues going with, inequities in their laws, but they have made vast strides. I think 70% of their college graduates are women, and women are actually being sought out in terms of employment in government and other companies because they're viewed as much more reliable. They have a better reputation in terms of corruption, et cetera, et cetera. So you have countries like the United Arab Emirates, and then you have countries like Yemen, although they have made, and Chris is going to talk about it, they have made progress. There still are terrible problems with illiteracy and other problems, child marriage, which we still need to address. So you can't look at the entire Middle East, and we saw in Lebanon how there's a lot more kind of liberalism in that society when it comes to women's status. So, and of course in Tunisia we're looking at a model constitution in terms of women's rights, in the Muslim world and what they've achieved since their revolution. So, we have to look at various countries, really kind of do the deep dive and see, what could be our strategy in addressing specific problems that women have in those specific countries. For example, we've seen also strides in the Palestinian Authority. The ambassador and I were visiting there. We met with the women, the Minister of Women's Issues, and she said they've managed to achieve actual gendered units in all of their ministries of government. So, I mean, there are strides, some strides being taken in various governments. But then we look at countries, and I want to bring up the issue of gender-based violence. We look at countries such as Egypt and other countries in the Middle East where we really need to respond to the problem of gender-based violence and the ability of young women in general, to occupy and to feel free to move in public space. Because if you're afraid to go out and work in public space and take public transportation or what have you, what is going to be your ability to actually get involved in politics? Are you going to want to take public transportation to go to those meetings in the evening? Are you going to want to, go to whatever it's going to take to campaign because you feel nervous about being, attacked in Tahrir Square or wherever you're going? So, young girls, and we've seen these, social media promotions and educational, videos and whatnot. What, for example, Egyptian women are facing when they go out in public, and what is going on there. And you've seen that the government is trying to do things. There was a sexual harassment decree that was put into effect. Some people are being prosecuted for a recent attack. So there are some steps being taken, and I think a lot more of that needs to happen as well to show women that they're going to be protected when they go out into public spaces. And I think that's very important that they feel secure about that. So again, we're looking at that area as well. Another area that we looked at was, and this kind of feeds into that, was mobility. For example, when we were in Jordan, we heard from a lot of women, well, we want to do more, we want to work and whatnot, but there are problems with public transportation. So getting from point A to point B is going to take me so many hours. I have to go back and take care of the family. Just logistically, it's not really possible for me to get involved more in the community or whatever. So they have, just like we do, we have all these practical problems, logistical problems with getting involved. They also face, these logistical problems plus the issues that we have, which, childcare and, the issues you raise, networking, campaign funds, et cetera, et cetera. So not only are they looking at that, but they're looking at a whole other broad area of logistical issues that they have to address in these countries. Now, just on what, we're kind of a small office. We have a relatively small budget. We do have funding that goes toward some of these types of programs throughout the world, actually. A lot of our sister offices in the department, as well as USAID, have some really phenomenal programs going on in the region, and a Middle East Partnership Initiative as well has a lot of programs. All over, and I don't want to go into, we have programs in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Yemen, that look at, including working with NDI, looking at how we can facilitate women's political participation, which ranges from capacity building to organizations, media skills development, et cetera, et cetera. So the U.S. government does have a kind of a broad array of these types of programs. We're trying to work in the region, and then we see, that of course there are a lot of bright spots in the region, and there's also a lot of, challenges that we have to face, including, what we're seeing going on in Iraq today. What we're, of course, Syria is a major challenge, and all the children that are going without school in Syria for years. We're looking at that as well. In Iraq, it was really very heartening to see that 22 women, according to their elections commission, were elected, popularly elected to the parliament last month. So, that was really encouraging to see that. Of course, these women, and everyone in their parliament are dealing with incredible challenges today. So I'm happy to provide you with, we have a little bit of information on our office if you'd like, or if you want to hear more about other programs, I'm happy to talk about that. But I do think that these are really, really important issues. I think that there are opportunities in the Middle East now after we've seen this transition. So I think that we have to embrace the opportunities and work through the challenges and be realistic, and at the same time be optimistic that things will change. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Betty. It's really interesting to hear about the wide-ranging efforts that your office is taking on, and the broader department as well. I think also a really key point that you raised is that all of these issues are interconnected, and that is so key. We're not working on women's participation in this silo, but we want to be thinking about adolescent education, girls' education, gender-based violence, security, health, all of those things, because they impact the ability for women to participate in just those structural and logistical things, the sociocultural barriers that are in place are all playing into the realities that our programming space on the ground. So thank you very much for that. Now we're going to turn to another example to look a little bit more at some programming that we're doing in another Middle Eastern country, which is Yemen. Chris Miller is a program officer here at NDI on our Middle East and North Africa team. And Chris, we look forward to hearing from you about what we're doing in Yemen.
First of all, thank you, Rouane. As someone who works on Yemen, it's always helpful and instructive to see what's happening elsewhere in the region on these issues. I think Yemen is sort of an interesting contrast to Lebanon in some important ways, whereas Lebanon is sort of the most progressive society in the Middle East. It's known as that. Yemen's oftentimes considered one of the more conservative societies. It's consistently last on a variety of indices. It placed last on the UN Gender Inequality Index. It placed last on the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Index. And these issues that Betty brought up about education for young women is something that we see to a large extent in Yemen, where young women will go through primary school, but not beyond that. And so the literacy rates are incredibly high, so there's these barriers for women to participate in a meaningful manner in the political process in Yemen. That said, there's a pretty profound shift going on in Yemen. It's not that it began with the 2011 uprising, but it's a nice sort of place that we can start looking as a turning point. You saw in popular uprising, you saw women's groups were a lot of times really at the forefront at the protests. And then as the protest movement gained momentum, you saw the women's organizations coalesce and get behind a sort of a more united voice for a 30% quota, initially in the National Dialogue Conference, which was part of the transition agreement in Yemen, to establish this body that would make recommendations to a constitution drafting committee. And so women's groups were able to organize effectively and get 30% of the participants at the NDC were women. And then with advocacy efforts didn't stop there. At the NDC, there was a recommendation made that we have 30% gender quota across all government institutions, legislative, executive, and judiciary. So at this time where we have terrible levels of women's political participation in Yemen, we're seeing this dramatic shift. And it's not that it's just something that's elite-driven, or there's been a lot of international involvement in transition in Yemen, so it's not solely that the international community is pressuring, there's really a shift happening in society. NDI has a fairly extensive research program there, and so since early 2013 we've done 3 surveys, and consistently 2/3 of the society support the gender quota. And unfortunately we don't have data on this from before the revolution, so we don't know how dramatic that shift is. But the fact that it's been that consistent is really telling, I think. And there was some concern that after the NDC concluded and formally recommended to the Constitution Drafting Committee that a 30% gender quota be put in place, that you would see sort of the people that are against that would come out and become more vocal, and you'd see a drop-off. But our last survey happened well after the NDC, and the levels are sustained. And then in our focus groups, we're also seeing there's a pretty profound shift as well, and there's almost like this demonstration effect, where we'll be speaking with men in a rural region, and they're saying, well, you know, they did great at the NDC. We saw women participating in the political process, and they did a great job. We saw them standing up to tribal leaders or former ministers and holding their own. And so as people see women in these political roles, there's a shift in the sense of how women can be involved in politics. Our programs, we have a pretty aggressive women's political participation program. We see this really as a historic moment for Yemen and for the region, really. So leading up to and during the revolution, we began working with some of these women's groups. And then as the discussion in Yemen started to shift, and it appeared that they would change the electoral system from first past the post system to a closed list proportional representation system, women in political parties started to feel like we really need to get organized because the party is going to be the avenue to power in a closed list PR system. And so this alliance formed, the Amal Alliance. It has 8 parties, and then there's a bunch of women from other parties, some of the more conservative parties, that their party won't formally become part of the alliance, but the women who are part of those parties want to be involved. And so they were instrumental in advocating for the quota within the NDC. And then at the NDC, they advocated strongly for the recommendation of a 30% gender quota in Parliament. And it was a really, really cool advocacy campaign. Both grassroots that went out and held town hall type events, but they also went to the delegates of the NDC and said, are you for or against the quota? And for those that were for the quota, they got this nice, prominent necklace. And so it clearly marked who was for it and who was against it. And so it at once rewarded and punished those that were with or against them. And then after the NDC concluded, it had been largely based in Sana'a, in the capital, where the NDC was happening. There was a concern that communications through the NDC had not been the greatest. And so a lot of women throughout the country wouldn't know that this was a recommendation, and they wouldn't hold the leaders accountable, because the recommendations would go to the Constitution Drafting Committee, and then that Constitution will be subject to a constitutional referendum. So they wanted to make sure that women voters understood that this is a game, and we need to continue to push for this. So they did this nationwide tour, reached thousands of women, and really raised the awareness of the progress that had been made. One interesting tactic, which I gather has been used elsewhere, is that they have never advocated for a women's quota. They've always advocated for a gender quota. And so when they face pushback, they say, well, you know, it protects men as well. Men will always have to be 30% of the parliament. And the day that men are not 30% of the Yemeni parliament is going to be, I mean, that will just never happen. But it's great, because it sort of neutralizes this idea that we are fighting exclusively for women's rights. We're just fighting for greater gender equality. And it was really, really interesting. Another more controversial sort of tactical decision they made, because they've gotten a lot of pressure from the international community and elsewhere, to tackle this issue of child marriage. And it's not that they don't hold that issue dear, that they don't plan to address it, but they first, as a first step, they say we need to institutionalize our power. Once we have 30% of decision-making bodies, that's when we'll be able to sustainably make some of those changes. So they've had to make some really tough decisions, I think, as well, and faced a lot of different pressures, but they've really united strongly behind this one point that they need to advocate on. So NDI's role in all of this, we helped facilitate the creation of the Amal Alliance, this cross-party network, and did a lot of capacity building with them, and brought in experts, international experts that have done these sort of advocacy campaigns elsewhere, and helped guide them and strategize with them as to what would be the most effective way to get what you want. And then, in anticipation of the quota being passed, because we really, really hope that it will be, we have begun a women's leadership program. It started in March with the Women's Leadership Academy. We had 150 women candidates from all over the country, every single government, every single political party, and a wide range, age range. I mean, it was really phenomenal. And some of the stories you heard from some of these candidates were amazing. There's this one woman from Hajj, it's in the Northwest, it's a typically very conservative area of the country, and she's always been politically active. She's a grandmother of 5 or something. And since '93, when Yemen had its first multi-party elections, she's always taken to organizing in her village. And at some point, at one of the subsequent elections, there was pressure on her that she shouldn't be doing this, she shouldn't be organizing women. So she sort of took advantage of a local tradition, which was if you give somebody a gift, they're obliged to come see you. So she arranged to have all these empty candy boxes placed in the middle of the village, and then gave kids a little bit of money to run these all over the village to all the women's houses. They were just empty boxes. But this meant that all the women had to then come say thank you to her. So she had like 1,500 women over the course of days and weeks coming, and she said, that's wonderful, but here's all this voter education material, and you really should go vote. So there's really innovative ways of making sure that women participate. And so, she was one of our participants in the campaign school, and she has this great quote. 5 years from now, I hope that as women, we have reached the decision-making positions and we have gotten the 30% quota. Our goal is not only 30%, our goal is to have more, so we can eliminate the stereotype that only men can be in political office and participate in elections. So back to the programs now. That academy is sort of the first step. Graduates of that academy go on to what we call a master's series, where they gain particular political skills. We have one master's series for independent candidates and some of the challenges they'll face in a closed-list PR system, but also to improve the skills of women who are going to run on one of the party's lists, because they need to be an asset to the party to get onto that list and to get high onto that list. And then the graduates of the master's series will take part in, or are now eligible to be part of the M to Nones list, which, as you might gather from the name, is structured based on Emily's list in the United States, which, if you're not familiar with it, was started in the 80s as a tool for progressive women candidates who lacked resources, who were not able to get the ear of party leaders to get resources and get organizing and get skills. We can't obviously help them fundraise, because we don't want to break Yemen electoral law, but the members of this list can have access to consultative advice, can have access to more one-on-one training on public speaking or whatever skill it is that they need to work on. And so each party will have a dedicated expert that will work with that party as the election approaches. And so that's sort of the candidate component. And then the NDC was wonderful in that it created this public space where there was constant dialogue. Since the end of the NDC, there's not as much public discussion. So we're going to launch a radio show, a women's radio show, and radio is particularly high among women in rural areas, so it's a great way to reach that constituency, and it would be a place to tackle issues important to women candidates, for women candidates to have debates. And we pair that with civil society listening groups, particularly in rural areas, can sort of serve as an incubator for voter education, voter mobilization, these sort of things. And then finally, we're working directly with the political parties on the establishment or strengthening of women's caucuses within the parties, but also in discussions with the leaders of the parties, so they can better understand the women candidates that are coming up in their party. And the next step, obviously, would be to, once the elections happened, inshallah in 2015, to have a women in governance program, so that the women that are elected under the quota are not immediately thrown out because they don't have the experience that so many of the men that are going to be running and that are going to succeed will have. I think there was one other point I wanted to make briefly. I guess not.
Maybe it will come to mind once we're having a discussion. Thank you, Chris. It's very interesting to hear a very different context, but some of the same challenges, and also just the really strategic approach that it sounds like women are taking. So that's great. Well, we'll open it up to questions and discussions now with our remaining time. We have a couple people with microphones, so just let us know if you have a question, and if you could just actually frame it in the form of a question, that's always appreciated, and keep it fairly brief, and then feel free to direct it to a particular panelist if you'd like. So we'll take a couple questions and then give the panelists a chance to respond.
Thanks. My name is Tariq Hasrani with the Islam Institute. Some of the new wave approaches in doing gender equity work is to work with men and changing norms around males. So I'm wondering if Sarah and else on the panel knows of some of these initiatives that are working with men, especially around political participation.
I mean, I'm not an expert on gender issues, but I can speak to some of the steps we've tried to take in Yemen. One of them is that as part of this women's leadership program, we don't just meet with potential candidates or potential campaign managers. We'll include the families and try to include the husbands and the sons and the other male members of the family to manage expectations, because running for office is a labor-intensive thing, and so to make sure that there's buy-in at that front end and to help the family understand that there may be some gender-based attacks on their wife, their mother, their sister, whoever it may be. So that's one example of how we're addressing this in Yemen, and then also at the party level. Almost all party leaders are men, and so just sort of consistent engagement on that, and not solely sort of sitting in meetings and trying to convince them of the value of having women, but helping them understand the reality of the quota system, and that this means that if this comes to fruition, it's in your interest to identify the strongest women candidates that you can, and to gender mainstreaming throughout your party, because it's going to be 30% of the parliament. Those are two examples I think to mind.
I am familiar with a few programs, and I think that this is being recognized more and more, the importance of engaging men and boys, and including with our embassies and consulates, that when they have programs that address these issues, to make sure that you don't just include in your audiences or your invitees, women or young women that are interested in this, but you also broaden that to include men and boys to discuss these issues and to raise these issues. And I do know that the U.S. government basically does have programs where, in terms of advocacy campaigns and others, where these issues are discussed in, mixed groups, and that they're particularly targeted, for example, in local religious leaders and other leaders who are men, to raise their awareness of some of these issues. So I think more and more that the importance of this is being recognized and integrated into these programs.
Oh, I'll just add for Lebanon that what I know from the women's movement is that they've been lobbying to obviously male parliamentarians because they want them to pass the quota. And funny enough that a lot of the men parliamentarians, the males, would tell them that before that yes, we are for the quota, we are supporting women, we are with you, we are your allies, but then when it comes to the vote, actually in the parliament, they end up not voting for it. So that's kind of an interesting dynamics that I've heard them talk about.
Hi, my name is Anna Lamb with the Washington Institute. This question is more Lebanon specific. So I was there last year, and the feel that I got was that people, especially the youth, men and women, are very apathetic to politics because of the environment there, sectarian divisions and stuff. Like if you go onto AUD's campus during school elections, the person being elected for school president is backed by the march. You have the March 14th and March 18th or March 8th movements on campus. So and people can't run with the unaffiliated parties because they don't have the money, they don't have the resources, you can't get elected that way. So my question is, on the one hand, women do want to get into power and they want to become politicians. On the other hand, the youth, a majority of the youth don't want to touch politics because of the sectarian divisions. So how do you see this changing? How do you see women becoming more and more involved in the political process without a conjugal reclamation?
You've touched on a very important problem that's happening. I had, for the film, interviewed people. I was there in 2005 and 2009 elections, before the elections and during, and I interviewed people on the street and some young people beyond what we've seen here in the film. And I got that response that they were saying, why even bother to vote? The vote is not even transparent, it's not even transparent elections, and that they're all the politicians are the same, they're all corrupt, they're all bad, they're not doing anything for the country. So there was a lot of apathy like that. And that's also said about, well, like you said, the youth, both men and women. For women, there's that general tendency that women think of politics as something dirty, and it's all nepotism, and it's all corrupt. So they don't want to be involved, and the weight of the memory of the war is pretty heavy, even for the younger population who were born or right after the war. There is that, it's a strong memory. So, and the people who are in power now and for the last 10, 15 years and even before, well, at least let's say talk about the last 15 years, many of them are warlords. They were people who came to power after the war because they were heading militias and political parties, not just political parties, but literally criminal militias in my mind, and had blood on their hands, and these are the people who are in the government. So for the younger, or people who are more civil society minded or independently minded, who want to see a real reform, it's an environment that's a turnoff. It's not challenging. That's what I can say. I don't know what the solutions are, but this is the environment that what you described is true.
I'm happy you said warlords. I wanted to say earlier that the problem with the system is it's run by wealthy families and warlords, but I thought that was too extreme. But it's true. Yeah, I mean, what you said is true, and I mean, that's one of the biggest problems that we face with our programming is how do we get people to want to participate in a system where they feel like it's rigged, where they feel their vote doesn't count. And I mean, that's why, I mean, NDI's programming in Lebanon focuses purely on civil society. This Women in Parliament program that we work on, we do kind of hard. I mean, it's really hard to have programming on that does focus. There's not a lot of money, not a lot of interest in supporting women in Lebanon right now. And but so we focus on civil society. We partner with Body with CCR, and they do really exciting events that are geared towards youth, like concerts and things like that, to try to get them to come out and then listen to their campaign and to hear about. I mean, in particular, in CCR, they have 18 reforms that they want to try to implement, and one of them is to lower the voting age to 18, and then obviously the women's quota, and then they have a variety of others. And so, I mean, I guess we do just little small steps to try to get youth involved and youth interested, and then, when it comes to women, particularly when we are, when NDI is talking about potential of running, I mean, you said it, you said that you cannot run in Lebanon as an independent candidate. I think that's pretty true in a lot of countries. I think it's probably true in Yemen. Anytime we're at a campaign school, our main expert is always counseling the women of, I know you don't want to join a political party, especially in Lebanon, but you have to if you want to make it progress or make a difference. And so, I mean, I don't know, it's really hard to answer your question, like where do we see it going? And I don't really know. Hopefully though, just little small engagement programs we can try to inspire more participation. And I mean, youth do, I mean, they vote quite heavily in universities. I mean, political parties on campuses is pretty normal in the Toronto MENA region, and so youth are very much involved, and we just got to transfer that into a way for the bigger system. I don't know. Sorry. It's the best I got.
I think we'll take 2 more questions. There are 4 more questions lined up.
Hi, my name is Lana Jafar. I work with NDI on the Egypt program, but I used to work in Lebanon with NDI, and your film brought back many memories. I was there during 2005 and working with Bade and women candidates actually back then. So thank you for bringing back good memories. So Rouane, I wanted to ask you, what did you hope to achieve with this film? And do you have any future projects to build on this? How do you see yourself playing a role in pushing for change or greater women's political participation in Lebanon?
Well, thank you for enjoying it and really touched you. I'm very happy. That's my goal, actually. You are a representative of the audience that I wanted to reach with the film. The film is made in English for a non-Arabic speaking audience, not for Lebanon. So I'm not really using it, even though I did show it in a couple of high schools at IC and Al-Qasid School, for those of you who know Lebanon. And the Ministry of Education has a copy of it. So there has been talk about showing it. I have a subtitled version in Arabic that could be seen in educational settings, mostly academic, high school, college. It's been a financial and a logistical barrier because I live here and I don't, like, basically you want to pay people to kind of organize a screening or distribution plan over there, and that hasn't happened so far. But really my goal is to show this film in the United States or around the world, because I feel that, like somebody, maybe you were saying earlier that we don't hear a lot about Lebanon in general, besides the negative things, and not much about the women of Lebanon. And I wanted to kind of break a little bit whatever stereotypes people had, and just give a face to Lebanon, to women in Lebanon, and to kind of bring that topic to the forefront for discussion. So that's my goal, and I think being here is part of what I'm hoping to achieve. Does that answer?
And any future plans?
Oh, plans. I'm interested. Well, I'm interested in the theme. So, and I don't think we mentioned it's kind of a little bit pessimistic on the parliamentarian level, and that's what we've been talking about. But on the municipal level, there are a lot of women, a lot more, not a lot, but it's a much better situation than it is on the parliament level, where there are women mayors and women in the local municipal positions, local councils, etc. And that is, I think, where the breakthrough is going to be. That's where the future for women in Lebanon to break. And there, it's a lot easier. It's a smaller community. If the woman is from a small village, that's where she's born. The community knows her and supports her. So they end up being able to reach positions and take action, because so they focus on very specific objectives for their community related to environment, water, electricity, things that they have the power to kind of affect and influence. So I know I want to put a plug in for an organization called Women in Front. I don't know if you're familiar with it, and they receive funding from the U.S. or funding. And they do trainings for women. They focus on municipal and on parliamentary women candidates. So they're actually training women to know how to run for a campaign, how to raise funds, how to speak in public, different things like that. And I think there's a good hope that it's a fairly new organization. It's been around maybe 2009, if I'm not mistaken. And they work with CCER, they work with the women's movement to push the quota. They believe in the women's quota very much. They don't see that there's going to be a change except top down through a quota system. I've heard some other folks say, well, the women are not supporting women. Women have to change their own attitudes. Women have to take the issue in their own hands, or you have to change the mentality of the culture, all of that. I think those things, of course, you can work on them, but for Lebanon, having a quota would really make the change. And once you have, we've seen in all the other Arab countries that have quotas, like the North African countries, Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria, as well as Iraq and Jordan, have more women in politics than Lebanon. Egypt used to have that, not anymore. They used to have enough women in their parliament, and now there are barely any. So that quota system has worked around the world, not just in the Arab countries. And I personally believe that this is what could be a solution.
Thank you. I think given the time, we'll go ahead and stop here, but certainly if you have further questions, I think our panelists can stay for a few minutes to continue the discussion. I also wanted to mention we do have some copies of the film available for purchase, so if you're interested, please come see Rouane. And just thank you again to our panelists and to all of you for coming today. Thank you.